All right, I guess I have the first thing on the agenda, so I will explain that real quick. Just kind of looking for a yes or no on this question on kind of an older pull request, because it came up again in another function definition being added, and it would be nice to get an answer on this before we start adding too many functions. In this pull request, there was basically a suggestion for how do we express the return type of a function like coalesce, where based on the input types and their nullabilities, you should be able to know the nullability of the output. So for example, if you have a coalesce function and all of the inputs are any of the inputs are non-nullable, then the output will be non-nullable. But if all of the inputs are nullable, then the output is nullable. So there's basically two approaches. One, we can use the syntax we have today. Oh, you know what? Three approaches. And I think this actually got brought up before, and I'm sort of remembering it now as I'm explaining it. But one approach is we can use the syntax we have today, which is err on the side of just making it nullable. Two is we could use the syntax introduced in the pull request, which is to use either or question mark or and question mark to say if all the inputs are nullable or if all the inputs are non-nullable. And then three is that we could find some way to express that shorthand as like a formula using the same thing we do for decimal type, the decimal functions where we like decimal addition, where we have a formula that calculates the output type.
I mean, the one question that I have in my mind when you're talking about these things is the scenario where, let's say I have a coalesce. I'm trying to think of a scenario here, but it's like, let's say that I have like a numeric, times two, coalesce times two function. I'm just making up an arbitrary thing, right? Or times x function. And the first argument is the amount that we're going to multiply by. And then the rest of the arguments, we take one of those things and multiply it. And so in that scenario, the nullability, to me, the question is that I think that the syntax you're talking about here would be like all arguments, or is it like how do you deal with like a situation where a subset of the arguments influence the nullability of the output in the shorthand? Is there a way to do it? That's the question I'm trying to ask. I can't come up with an example, but I'm sure if I spend a little more time with it, I could come up with an example. I'm just like, that's the question in my head. Like, if I've got let's say I've got 5 arguments and 4 of them influence the nullability of the output type. Right? Is that expressible with each of the 3 solutions you were thinking about?
Not with the first, because that one's already not able to express everything. Not with the second either. That would be, I suppose, an argument for the third solution, where you could refer to each argument individually somehow. I think that, yeah, so not with the shorthand, no. That would be an argument in favor of the more complex.
In the text format, I'm planning on just going with some sort of simple rules, which might be first, it might be the second, or whatever, and having people explicitly say what it is when it's different, which you can't. Which I have this particular instance in mind where this is the general case, but yeah, so I guess this doesn't really help that much. But I sort of lean towards wanting the full expressed version so it makes the text format easier. So people wouldn't have to specify the nullability.
I didn't follow what you were saying. If everybody else did, we can move on. But I didn't follow what you were saying.
I'm more interested in having a fully expressed language for the text format, because I can use it as the definitions to make it easier to eliminate the need to provide the explicit type of an output of a function in the proto.
So I think in all three solutions, things will be fully expressed in the YAML. What we're talking about here is not leaving it ambiguous as much as erring on the side of caution at a potential loss to optimization if anyone really cares about nullability. So like for coalesce, the just approximate with what we have today solution is we say the output of coalesce is always nullable, which is imprecise but fully specified.
But you can go beyond nullable, right? So nullable is one problem. The other problem is I've got 5 different input types. Maybe they're all in 30 various versions of int, and I take the biggest one, or something like that. So you're computing of what the type, or there's a count. Well, count's easy, but it's some case where it's not easy to determine what the type would be, not just nullability.
In all cases in the YAML, I believe in the YAML we have to always explain the output type.
Oh, well, there's usually any, right? And then
so I see what you're saying.
Well, but any is not any is a specific any, right? Like any is not like I don't know. It's like, hey, like let's use the the concept of a first function where you say like it's a var arg of any type, and then the output is any. It means that all of the inputs have to be the same type, and the output is going to be the same type as the inputs. So any like any is like a variable definition. It's just a variable definition that means like there's a lack of clarity in the distinction between like any and t. I don't know if we've gotten rid of the t's, but realistically they're just 2 different ways of expressing the same thing, which is it's a placeholder that is reused multiple times in the definition. I mean, so going back to the original question, Weston, like my inclination, I don't have a strong inclination on this. Like my weak inclination is that first have something that expresses the concepts in a complete manner, and then the second one is like if we can have a shorthand to express a common pattern, that might make sense. But as I said, I hold it weakly. I could see doing it in the other order. The one concern I have is whether or not, like, the moment we look at the fully expressed thing, we're going to realize that the shorthand is somehow castrated in a way that is unfortunate.
For like shorthand, this sort of what the nullability handling options on the functions are. Like we have like mirror, declared output, and discrete, and mirror sort of seems like the inverse of this, where mirror is if any of the arguments is null, then the output is nullable. Like will there be a room for like an opposite one, which is if any of the options is non-null and the output is null, non-null? Like this won't work for coalesce, or this won't work for. Actually, coalesce is probably fine, but there might be some like any kind of like comparison function or any kind of conditional function you might need to be if these specific arguments are non-null. But like for the general case of I have a function where I take multiple inputs, and if any of them is non-null, then the output is like not null. Like that might just be a shorthand, might be a nullability handling option for that. We'll probably still need a fine-grained case for more interesting functions, but
Well, I like the thinking. The question I have is that like, is there lots of these or is there like one? Because the other case, right, the one where it's the definitions in that output type handling, right? It's because a huge portion of functions have this pattern, which is if at least one of the input types is nullable and the output type is nullable. That's a really, really common pattern. This other one, I don't think it is. I don't know for sure. I haven't spent much time thinking about it, but it seems like maybe it's just a coalesce problem. Or are there like a bunch of others, Weston, that you've seen that have the similar property?
So there are others that have the opposite property. I believe it was element-wise min or element-wise max. So where you basically take the smallest of all the arguments you're given. So if all of the arguments are nullable, or no, if any of the arguments is nullable, then the output is nullable. But it doesn't necessarily mean the same thing as
we already have.
No. It's not, because mirror. I mean, it depends on how you define element-wise min. If you define it, you could define it so that take the smallest non-null value that you encounter. Maybe that's the wrong way to define it, and so that's not. But if you had defined it that way, then you still have the same. Well, no, I guess then you're back to the same thing as coalesce, where you would have to have them all be null. And in fact, really, that is just an implicit coalesce. So maybe this is something that's just built in with coalesce. I'll have to. Right, because I mean, I think of the nullability options as sort of stating something that happens per row, where you're saying that if any of the inputs are null, then the output for that row is null, whereas nullability is more saying if any of the inputs are nullable, then the output might be nullable. That doesn't necessarily imply mirror, but maybe in all cases it does.
I'm confused by your comment because my at least the way that, yeah. Well, I mean, I think sort of like starting like a high level principle, right? Like, I think one of the rules of Substrate is that, well, I don't know that it's written anywhere as I say it, but I believe that one of the rules of Substrate is that that you can fully know all data types prior to inspecting data. And so any rules around output derivation are applied at the quote unquote schema level, not the data level, right? So decimal math, we don't know whether or not this is 32.1 or 32 point, like, sorry, if you have like, 6 decimal point digits beyond the decimal point, right? You don't, when you're starting with the value, you don't know if all 6 have meaning or if most of them are zeros, right? And you can't make a decision based on that. And so to me, all of the output type derivation rules are schema only operations. So it feels like one of the things you just said is that some of it would be data inspecting, as opposed to just what I would describe as sort of schema inspecting. And I feel like that's not true for any of the schema patterns, whether it's the options or the output derivation.
Sorry, what I was saying was that the nullability options affect more than just the schema. They affect the data. They tell the consumer essentially that we can take the nullability bitmap from all the arguments and OR them together, and that's the output nullability bitmap. So the nullability options, I'm not saying that you need data to determine the schema. I'm saying the nullability options affect the data. They are describing ways that the operation behaves and not just the way the data type is returned. So for an example function that would violate this would be if there was a function whose return type was nullable only if one of the inputs was nullable. But that didn't necessarily mean that if one of the inputs is null, the answer is null. So for example, a very made up function, but a function that basically says, return null if the input is null or 1. That has nullability mirror, true, because if the input is null, we know the output is going to be null. But yeah, never mind. Sorry, I'm explaining this poorly, I think. But anyway, I think
I think I understand what you're getting at for the distinction between like the row level execution or the column level execution versus like at the plan level. But I think if you have something like mirror, then like at the planning stage, more or less, it's going to be like this function has mirror. If in planning I see that all of the inputs to it are non-null, then I as the consumer can like optimize this function to be like, this is never going to be null. I don't ever need to look at the bitmaps.
Right.
Versus at the data schema layer, if you see that one of the columns is nullable, then like definitionally you're going to have to process it as if it's potentially outputting null at all points in time, because that's going to be data dependent. Like when you're processing it, it'll be different, but you can optimize it based on like the schema types that we know at plan time, not at like execution time.
Right. So here's my example then. Imagine you have add, which has mirror nullability, but you decide that the way you want to handle overflow is by setting the result to null. So then both your inputs could be non-nullable, but the output of your function is nullable. And maybe that's not.
I feel like that's a new function.
Okay.
I feel like that would be a new function because it's not mirror. Right? You can't use mirror if that's
new overflow behavior.
Okay. So mirror implies that if all your inputs are non-nullable, the output could never be null. Mirror means that the only way you can have a null in the answer is by having a null in the input.
It means that no, that is incorrect. The only way that you can have the way that you have nullable output is that at least one of the arguments is nullable.
Right, but
none of it is about the data. There could be no nulls in any of it. Or it could be that I have a function that never returns null, but always returns a null type.
Can you have a function that returns null even if the two inputs are not null?
Yes.
Let's say, okay.
But not with mirror.
Yeah, you have to use discrete or whatever the explicit like type is for the output.
But not with mirror. So that has to be declared nullability.
Yes.
Okay. No, I think you're right then. Okay, so then all we really do, I agree, a new nullability option to handle coalesce. I've come around.
Well, so my suggestion is to do something slightly different, because the new option to me feels a little bit weak or like incomplete. I'm wondering whether or not what we really need is a function which describes. I mean, I'm okay with the coalesce one. It's just I think it's very rarely used. And so the question I have is whether or not we should have a function which is, two functions maybe, at least one nullable and at least one non-nullable. And when I say functions, I mean output derivation type functions, or a little mini expression language. And it takes n arguments, which are the actual arguments from the function, right? So you could say arguments, 1, 4, and 7. If any of those are nullable, then this is the output type derivation. And so you just have two functions. One is like at least one nullable, at least one not nullable, or at least one required, whatever it is. And then you could write a conditional statement in the expression language to define what the output type is based on that. That would allow you to express the concepts where it may be that you only want to inspect a subset of arguments as opposed to all of them. And so that would be complete because it would also support expressing mirror, which is something that I don't think can be expressed right now in the expression language. So anyway, that's the question I have in my head is like, do we add inverse mirror and these two functions so that we cover the other parts? But I'm okay with just adding inverse mirror or whatever we want to call this thing. What's the mirror like matrix mirror? I don't know what the portal. A mirror, the opposite of a mirror is a portal, I think.
I'm going to advocate for a better, more descriptive terminology than that. But all right, let's move on. We have a lot of topics on the agenda. I think I agree. I think I understand what you're saying about the output derivation syntax, but I do think if it's just coalesce, let's just slap some kind of shortcut on this. Yeah. So when we have nullability, when we have mirror, what do we put in the YAML for the return type? We just ignore the whatever question mark. We don't have to put the question mark on the return type, and we ignore it there.
We shouldn't put a question mark on the return type because the question mark on the return type I would think would be an actual validation error.
Okay.
Because mirror is influencing the nullability of the output. I'm not sure that we validate for that right now, but to me, I think we should. Oh, I see. Let's go move to the next. Let's move to David's topic about this crazy ugly box he made.
Yeah, I was trying to make it very visible. So I tried to make a star kind of thing, and star was a little bit more complex than I could handle. And I took the existing what are they called? Admonitions or something like that. And this is and dressed it up, made it dismissible and whatever. But it really calls out, once you've dismissed it once, it won't show up again on the same browser. The real question is, so I guess ugliness is one thing, but huge amount of JavaScript is the other, because I used a lot of JavaScript to generate it. Which is a lot more than we have for anything else on the Substrate page. I do want to use more JavaScript for things like getting our calendar for this meeting up on our page. But so this is this is going down that slippery slope of adding more and more JavaScript to our page. And I guess the question is, are we okay with the JavaScript? And then do we want changes to the ugly box?
I mean, I think that the high level bit for me is that I'd like to leverage a standard framework as much as possible so that we don't have to maintain something like this. And so I'd be like, I mean, again, loosely held, but like my preference would be is if it's not a well-used makedocs or makedocs material extension, let's just not do it. That would be kind of my perspective. Just because this to me is the classic thing of that has code rot, because it's just like and so like staying as much as, and we've had this conversation I think a long time ago where people were trying to build stuff that rendered pages and stuff, and my ask was as much as possible is to use the makedocs framework, just because it makes it much more maintainable for everybody else. So that's my main comment is like, you know, did you first go and see if you could find something that has roughly this behavior as a makedocs or makedocs material extension? Like, because there's two different things, right? One is it's like the functional capabilities, and the other is the styling.
Right. So this is makedocs. This is an admonition, which is a standard makedocs feature. Just dressed up to have jagged box plus the dismissible feature. So it actually it uses local storage to save whether you dismissed it again, so you never see it again once you've dismissed it. But otherwise, it's an admonition dressed up in JavaScript.
So the JavaScript is only necessary to prevent the user from seeing this on future visits to the site, correct?
Well, that's half of it. The other half is making this is some of, well, actually you're right. Most of it's CSS for the other stuff.
Right. The making the box is just custom CSS, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I do end up, I guess, to have the X on the right, I end up doing some JavaScript. But
it's a meta question. So it sounds like what we're doing here is we're trying to guide more people towards the tutorial so that we have. Is there any reason why we would want that to be dismissible? Is that not something that could just be on the landing page like forever?
Yeah, I mean, my main thought is that like if the homepage needs to be updated to be much more of a guiding homepage, and one of the first things in the homepage is the tutorial, I just kind of do that. Like I feel like this is a little bit what's the word? It's a little bit like Times Square-y. And I don't think we need to be that way. Like if you come to the homepage and there's two important things you need, we can just make it be those two big buttons. One is like go to the tutorial, and one is something else, right? Like, so like trying to increase the noise level, the brightness of something is one option. To me, the other option is that we just decrease the brightness of other things. Right? Yeah. I think Gil's said like something.
Yeah,
like
I'll just add that this is what we did in IBIS with Make Docs, which is just, what were the things we needed at the top level, like a getting started guide and how to install it. So there's two big buttons at the top.
Yeah. Yeah. So I'd be more inclined to moving towards something like that than trying to, add neon. It's just like let's just decrease the noise of other things.
Yeah. I mean, I could see that. I mean, there's the one thing you're not seeing, and this is the menu structure, which of course has the tutorial already there. So if you increase it by putting buttons up at the top, you're gonna have those buttons at the top plus the menu structure, which is duplicative.
I don't think it's increase it by adding. I think what Jacques is saying is take away everything, like for the extreme, take away everything so that the only thing you see when you go to substrate.io is the menu at the top and then a paragraph or heading or regular admonition or whatever that says try the tutorial. So it's Jacques is saying we need to remove things from the main page as much as possible so the tutorial stands out naturally on its own.
Yeah, and I mean, I think that there's another thing here that we've done that is, I mean, this is the nature of organic growth of something like this, is that I generally follow a rule that there shouldn't be more than 5 top-level navs. So if you look at where we are now, it's like 10, which is kind of a mess. And so to me, like, yeah, like, so to me, like, change the homepage content. Like, I don't know that this is the most important homepage content. Like, it kind of goes, I think it was what I wrote, 18 months ago. So clearly it needs to be updated. So like being like, hey, here's a tutorial, here's 3 ways that you can use it, would probably be a really natural thing to have on the homepage. Yeah, and so yeah, to me it'd be like, do that. I'd probably get rid of the left-hand sort of sub-nav for the homepage specifically, so it's less distracting. I think we could probably just turn that off for that one page. But yeah, I kind of go that direction, and then I think at the same time, I really think that we need to go from, like we talked before about moving all the spec stuff, like types, expressions, relations, serialization, extensions, as under spec. We just haven't done it. That's sort of going beyond, but like I feel like we have a bunch of maintenance here that we haven't done, and so David is doing the pragmatic thing to try to get people to focus on the right thing. But I feel like at the end, what it underscores is the fact that we just haven't nurtured the website. We've kind of thrown some additional content there, but we haven't been like, okay, let's think about what the homepage should be, right? And so, yeah, so so I feel like this is kind of off topic from what the original question was. Like the original question to me is, what do you think about using JavaScript? I think my main thought is that like, try not to. That's my main thought. As much as possible, because I'm like, except in rare cases where we think it's important.
So I'll jump in here and say that the other example David brought up was the calendar for this meeting that we're in right now. And I did actually look around a little bit when I heard there was no MKDocs extension. I thought surely there is one, but there isn't. There's no way that I can find using MKDocs to throw up a Google Calendar link. And I think that's one where I think the JavaScript would be justified, for example.
Is it to like embed the calendar in the make docs, or it's not sufficient to link out to it?
You can make a link, but you can't make like a little embedded widget, I guess, that shows the calendar itself. Or I don't know what your proposal ends up looking like. I haven't actually tried to run it, David, but you can probably explain it better than I can.
Yeah, so I want to see a real calendar.
Yeah, to me, yes, I think I like, to me, there are definitely good examples of places where we should be able to do, like, I'm not against JavaScript, but like, to me, like, as an example would be how does everybody embed Google Calendar? Let's do that. Like, that would be the way I think about it, right? To me, the main thing is trying to avoid custom code that we're doing in a unique fashion.
Yeah, well, the other approach would be to go and create a MakeDocs extension just so that you could include the MakeDocs extension, which seems like a little bit overkill.
Yeah, no, I'm not arguing for that per se. Like, to me, the goal is that we want to have something that we share maintenance of, right? It's hard enough for us to get PRs done for Substrate core. So doing PRs for maintaining some extension for MakeDocs website stuff. As we've already shown, we're not very good at maintaining the website. So maintaining code that very few people are familiar with for the website seems painful as well. Now, the flip side of it is I will argue that, like, probably if I encountered this code and needed to make a modification, I'd just hand it to ChatGPT and say, hey, modify it in this way, and hope that it did it right. And that's how I usually do my JavaScript these days. So it's easier now to do that than it used to be. Yeah.
Okay, I'm fully. I have no problem putting this on hold, seeing if we can do something else to make the tutorial more visible. So I will go and see if I can come up with something else for the front page instead. That's fine. And then, yeah, and the calendar I'll do at some later point. But I think it's going to require some JavaScript.
All right. Next item on the agenda.
The next item on the agenda is whether or not Absol status and status or is something reasonable to be including in Substrate CPP. It's Absol is a pretty large dependency. It's included by protobuf already, but status and status or are just placeholders, I guess, really, until C++ 23 comes up with standard accepted, which does the same thing, but we're not going to be able to use that until Ubuntu is basically up to that level, and right now we're stuck at C++ 17 for the for substrate CPP. So we're talking years. So what do we do in the short term, I guess, is do we try to hide it in something so that the external API doesn't use absol status and status, or do we expose it?
So I think one challenge is going to be that on this call, I don't know how many attendees are interested or up to speed on C++ best practices.
I'm like, people still use C++? Jesus Christ.
I say that every day when I write my code.
I suggest you use Rust and Go. I think the combination of those is much better.
All right. I will. I think I may have given you my 2 cents already. Generally try to avoid dependencies where possible. I think if this were not already exposed through protobuf, I would say it is worth creating our own polyfill in the public header to avoid a dependency. Since these dependencies are already introduced during protobuf, it may still be worth creating our own polyfill just so that we can move to, I don't know. I don't imagine protobuf is ever going to remove abseal as a dependency. So I think it's fine.
Yeah, not in our immediate lifetime anyway. Okay. That's it for me. Matan is next.
Am I? Okay, so just an update. I've had a meeting with the Intel folks. So finally, we got some attention from them or interest, which is good. They are willing to do the initial contribution, okay, so, which is much better than if we would do it because it's their code. They really ask if we can finish with the PRs they're waiting for. They're waiting for 2 PRs so that they can be compatible with the protos. I mean, without need to change it internally. There's one I think about the expand and one regarding window. I think in the channel it's mentioned in the Spark channel. So what they say is once those are merged, they can implement those missing parts and then they can do the contribution. And on top of that, we will add what we've added to the logical plans, and then we can start working from Substrate and not Gluten. So this is what we agreed. So they really asked me to help expedite the PRs. Any way we can do that?
I will say that expand, I think, is pretty much ready. I would encourage another look at it. I know we've gone back and forth on it like 20 times, but since then, I think we've gotten better understanding.
I thought that the definition we were locked in a long time ago. The problem was just there was not enough docs. Like half the options weren't explained in the docs in the spec.
I can check again, but I thought we did. At one point, I just, well, I can make another pass at it this week and just ping you.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's like concepts like the switching field is just not covered in the spec.
Okay.
Like, what is a switching field? What is an expanding field? Like there's just like some missing sections of the doc is my. I'm looking at it now. I haven't looked at it in a while, and I think that's the main thing is that like the docs I could never go from the docs to some kind of proto like what the proto is that we have.
Okay, so there's too much in the proto compared to what is in the, or basically what's in the markdown does not sufficiently explain what is in the proto.
Yes.
Yeah, I see that now. I can agree. I will.
Yeah. Yeah, I think
wording
the
this
model
out.
is good. I think that we just that's my feeling of why I was stuck was just that the docs were weak.
Okay, I'll take the action to update this and ping you probably this week. For the window relation, I would open it up to the broader audience, the same dilemma that we ran into, and I think we kind of hit consensus on it, but it isn't a begrudging consensus, which is, so just so everyone is up to speed, in the logical substrate plan today, you can express window functions as part of the expression tree, which means that a window function can pretty much be used everywhere that a scalar function can be used. So you could have, for example, a project relation that has regular scalar functions and window functions. This mirrors a lot when you're writing SQL and you have your select statement with your various expressions. You know, you would have scalar functions and window functions at the same level. When it comes to actually consuming these plans, most consumers that I have insight into, so DuckDB and Velox and Spark and Isero, have dedicated operators for handling window functions. So if your select statement has a combination of window functions and scalar functions, some of those will go into a project relation, and some of those will go into a window relation. And actually, DB, which has kind of the most complete implementation, will create a window relation for each combination of partitioning and sorts. So if you have, you know, select X, comma, you know, first Y over column 1, comma, first Z over column 2, that will end up creating 2 different window relations. So then the challenge that popped up was, okay, so now we're going to make a window relation, and it's going to have almost all of the exact same fields as the window function, which is also in the protobuf. So do we try and come up with some common messages that both of these concepts share? Or do we have duplicate messages, which there's like 5 or 6 or 7 different fields in the window function definition? Do we duplicate all of those fields between the two things? And I think we had a similar discussion with join and hash join a long time ago, and the gist has always been to lean on duplication and not try to reuse fields, because that leads to just too much trouble down the road. Victor, you're muted.
We've been looking at window function stuff as well recently for reasons, or we want support for it. And I guess the question that this brings up for me is, it sounds like we can express a window function with, or we can express window functions with window functions in a projection. And then there's an equivalent representation where you have an explicit window rel with those functions or some such. And it sounds like what we're kind of split on is whether it's the responsibility of the producer to generate a plan with a window rel in it, or the consumer to handle like, oh, I have a projection with a window rel. I should represent this internally as I want. I guess in the context of calcite, which is what I tend to look at, like there's an explicit window rel, which is kind of what I was kind of basing our implementation on. But it sounds like we should be able to transform back and forth somewhat. Or I guess going from the project.
Calcite isn't a great mapping because calcite is not consistent with the way that Spark and DuckDB do it, because calcite does not constrain a window rel to a single partition.
Okay.
Well, I said
partition is sort definition.
I know sort definition. Are you saying it might have multiple sort definitions within a single window rel?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I'm pretty sure when I ran my test, I know DuckDB does 2 rels. I'm pretty sure Spark did as well. Yeah. And
Yeah,
I don't know about.
I think a lot of systems do, but I think that the window rel in Calcite doesn't require that. So so I don't think I actually what I was going to say, Victor, is I don't think that there's. I think you're right, which is that we've got two different versions. This is just like an in clause or whatever, a multi-or list versus or a single or list versus a bunch of ors, right? They're two equivalent ways to express the same concept. And some people want one and some people want the other. And I agree that we should get to the point where we have the ability to translate. I think it's fine to have two. I don't think that's contentious. I think that when I was looking through it, the only thing that it seems to be an open question on it, Weston, is one that you asked me. Like, it seems like that's the only, like, I was just trying to read through all the review comments, because I hadn't looked at it in a while. And it seems like there's only one open question, Weston, which was, what is the purpose of hashing versus not? I think is the question you asked.
Right, there's a hash window rel and a stream window rel, I think.
Yeah, and so imagine you're doing count over partition.
Yeah.
Or sum over partition. In those situations, the window rel does not have to be. It can be a hashed window rel, and so it means you don't have to ever hold the whole set in memory at once. Like so there's certain functions where you don't have to hold the whole set in memory, and the other functions where you do. And so that's a distinction. And so at least when I've done this before, I've had separate operations for those two scenarios. The one where you have to hold the set and the one where you don't, because the one where you don't is a lot more like an aggregate operation. And so that's the distinction. It seems like it exists at this level as well. Whether it exists, because it's really a translation of the window functions, whether or not you need to hold the whole set at once. And that probably would have been a better description than streaming versus hash, would have been maintaining the whole set in memory versus not. Because that to me is in fact often a different operator. I don't know in the case of DuckDB or Spark whether it is, but that's what that's trying to express.
That makes sense. I'll have to like fully think through what like a hashing count window rel would look like, but I fully believe that, yeah, what you're saying is, I'll think through that when I'm worried about implementation, not when I'm worried about definition. So I assumed it was something like that. Like there's some weird way that you can use a hash to implement a window function in some cases. And so what you're describing.
Yeah, and it's really not that you use the hash per se. It's more that it's that you don't have to hold the whole set in memory. So the name is probably not the best. Okay. So anyway, if there's other contentious questions, ping me on them. It seemed like there wasn't much left on that one other than that question. So those are two of the issues. Are those, so going back to Matan's original comments, what is holding Intel from contributing, and it's merging some patches. These are two of them. I know that I've seen a bunch of other random patches from some Intel folks in the past that have been things that we are not super excited about accepting because they're not really making sense. Are there other patches that you feel like are blocking them as well, or is it really just these two?
This is what they told us.
Okay, they just said these two.
Me, yeah. If we have that, they can be compatible with the original product, like the central product definition. So.
Yeah, I think I've been on these emails as well, or some of them at least, and that's what I've seen too. Is that they've very much have a focus on these two PRs. They've had other PRs, for example, in the past to add aliases to expression nodes. Some of the stuff that Matan is doing in extensions, I think. But I don't.
We need to talk about that as well sometime because it's getting not now. I'll put it in the next meeting, I guess.
Yeah, but my understanding is that those are like nice to haves because it gives sort of more of like a full round trip, but not necessary to go from Spark to Substrate.
Cool. Is there anything else on the agenda today? Oh, validation, Victor.
I added this real quick because you said like you said the word, we should have a validation for this somewhere, and the question that always brings up for me is like, we have the Rust validator, but also there's the validation that Substrate Java does, which is sometimes different from the one that I imagine C++ does. And I guess how does validation work when you've got like 5 or 6 different client languages and they're all implementing some version of the spec? Like you mentioned this a couple of times, but I don't know if we've actually like solved it or.
Well, the vision was that the Rust library would be packaged up and used we would have bindings for the Rust library for all of the languages.
Okay, so the idea is that the Rust version of it is just not even the Rust version. It's just like that library is the canonical validator, and it should be like not necessarily the spec, but like any validation that it fails on, system should respect.
Yeah, and so that's why, at least my recollection is that it's not in the Rust repository, it's in the validator repository. So it's not the Rust library for Substrate, it's the validator application for Substrate. And so, yeah, so ideally we would have Java code in that repository and JavaScript code and Go code that allows you to easily invoke the validator and packaged versions of that for each of those languages. So whatever language you're in, you can invoke the validator to validate. That's the vision. Now,
okay.
As of right now, I don't know that anybody is using the validator in that way. But the idea was you could turn it on. So like if you were building an application, you might have it as a debug mode in your Java app. You could turn it on and use it if you wanted to. And if you wanted to go into production and didn't use it, you could turn it off. Something like that.
That makes sense. And that gives more credits to like, yeah, whenever we mention validations, I feel like I've always had that with like kind of like somewhat ambiguous as to like where does this live? But yeah, the idea of having the validation library that's like the core is Rust, everything can use it. That makes sense. Then we have a single piece of code that controls like what is or is not valid. Cool.
Yeah, and we did it in Rust in part because that was native code that was also not going to have a bunch of namespace collision problems, like dependency problems.
So does that mean for other things that we want to put them like the text format is in Substrate CPP, and I'm planning on having other things have a dependency on Substrate CPP? Is that something that the text format should be in Substrate text format so that other things can consume it and wrap it? Is that the model we're headed for?
I mean, that was to me, like having utility libraries makes sense. I think the problem, like the reason, yes, I think if the text format is a utility library, that is a cross-language utility library, we should ideally treat it differently than a client library for Substrate. Now, of course, CPP has the whole dependency hell problem. So, again, why would you use CPP? But anyway, just got a poke there again. But yeah, I think that if that's, honestly, I haven't been that close to the text format, but if you think that the intention of the text format is that it's a library that allows people to go from text to proto and proto to text, and people should be able to use it in any language, then yeah, that would make sense to me.
My intention is to basically replace the load from disk functions in every language and save in every language.
Yeah. So the only comment I'll make is that my main experiences in a lot of languages is that they start, if it is a performance critical thing, they'll stick with native code. If it's not performance critical, people very quickly get annoyed with a secondary language being sourced, and we'll try to move.
It's not going to be performance. It is not going to be performance critical because it's got to convert it from a protobuf, which is so. Just calling that API is going to be painful in itself. But yeah, the problem is that it's a lot of code, and there's a lot of code that's still to be written. So creating a native implementation, sure, You want to spend a year
Yeah.
porting it? Go ahead.
Yeah, I think that's just an addendum kind of onto Jacques' point, which is that either performance critical or so complex that nobody wants to rewrite it in a different format.
Yeah, I guess that's true.
Yeah. The biggest thing I
calcite.
would say is, yeah, exactly. Going back to your previous question about pulling in new dependencies, that becomes, yeah, like having a, what did you guys make a nano arrow because the original arrow was too freaking big? It kind of reminds me of that, which is that like, hey, if I want to use the protobuf text converter in Substrate, I don't think I should be depending on a lot of stuff. I don't think that should be a giant library. I think it should be like,
you don't want to
10K library.
The C++ library that includes Java so that it can do the compilation of the grammar.
Yes, that's true. I would not want to have that. I agree with you on that. Yeah. So I think that's to me that's the big question is that like decomposing these things could be really good. And so like if you source Substrate CPP to be able to do the text and text to proto, then it's like whatever, right? Like, okay, well, it doesn't matter if it's in a separate library because you have to source all the same shit anyway. But if you are only using like a little teeny bit of stuff, then I think it's definitely good to have in that separate library because if I'm pulling it in, having worked with I was recently working with the V8 in embedding V8 in other languages, and it's just a nightmare because the tool chain for getting it to compile on different things is brutally bad, right? Because like when we were trying to run on Lambda in ARM, using Node and Go, you're just like, oh my god, it's like a nightmare. So that'd be my comment there is that like keeping it small would be good if we can.
Yeah, I think like I would say it's less. Don't throw dependencies in just for fun because nobody really does that. But it's more keep in mind as you're adding new functionality. Like if we add to Substrate CPP the ability to grab YAML files off the internet, so now that we have a dependency on curl to do that the code is structured in such a way that a binding that just wants to grab the text converter should not need curl because they're not trying to use the YAML parsing feature, which I think you have done. I mean, you've kept things in pretty tight and small modules in the C++ code so that bindings could have fairly targeted. We may need to do a little bit of work in the CMake so you're exporting multiple different targets and not just one target. But having as minimal as possible target for text format or any kind of reusable tool that we want would be a good thing. I think the problem that we made in Arrow was that our core target included things like the AWS SDK and the compute functions, which are very heavy dependencies.
Okay. All right, I guess that's it for everything then.
And we're out of time. Thank you, everyone.
All right.
Bye.